Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and surviving in these very, very strange times. I live in Dublin. I normally commute over to Warwick, but we've been locked down here since the 18th of December, which is, while getting tiring, I think hopefully having some sort of positive impact on this whole situation. So today I just kind of want to talk around again what I talked about, which was Greek pots mostly, and kind of to talk around the syllabus. I think there's no point in me going on about your syllabus because you know it better than I do. So I thought that I would look at a few examples of pots here and just talk generally about maybe some of the issues in Greek art generally that we kind of think about as archaeologists and as Greek art historians. As I explained to Paul, in my house this morning, we had a power outage, which we've never had before. So I'm quite lucky that my partner runs a museum here in Dublin, and I'm able to come up to the museum, hence the background, and talk about a few things. So I thought that I would maybe just go through some of the main pottery styles again, very, very briefly, just to kind of elaborate in a few areas on what I talked about in the lecture, if that would be interesting or useful. I think it will. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the Corinthian style, the Proto-Corinthian style. Because, I mean, I see vase painting as very much, it's not a linear evolution in a simplistic way, but it is sort of a drive toward better narrative expression. So if you start from the geometric period, when everything's kind of abstract, it's about developing individual people, then developing characters and developing narratives. And the first sort of point on this journey starts really at Corinth for us today. So I have here a Corinthian Araballos. I thought it was useful to show this. If we had done this in person, we could have obviously used the Warwick collection, but these things are very, very small. So I talked about these in the lecture, and I don't know if you can see in the camera or not, but you can see how the black slip works and then the incision that works along this. So we have kind of like a lizard scale pattern of incision here. And these are really, really small, obviously, as you can see. I think when you see these things published in textbooks or in publications, it's often hard to get a sense for the size of them. And they would have contained scented oil. So in Corinth, mostly it was going to be lily perfume. Corinth had a long tradition of various perfumes that were based on olive oil, but lilies were the one that they were most famous for. And this is where we really first get a recognized kind of black figure style developing in Greek pottery. And it has the black slip, it has the incision, and most of these have, or many of these have paint as well, usually purple or white paint. One of the reasons we think that these are associated with oil and with scented oil is, if you look, it's got a very, very narrow opening, almost looks like a pencil sharpener. So when you see a vessel, a pottery vessel with a very narrow opening, generally we would interpret this as something that you don't want things to pour out of very quickly. And for that, it must be something precious, which is usually presumed to be oil or perfume in this case. And these are really cool. They show up all over the Mediterranean, Sicily, Italy, then over to kind of the Levant coast, down to North Africa and throughout the Aegean. And they're very, very, very popular vessels with presumably very, very popular Corinthian products in them. And they are usually found in graves. And again, if you'll remember from the lecture, this is a complete vessel, so it almost certainly came from a grave. And I think all the pots on your syllabus would have come from graves as well. If you get a complete pot, chances are it came from a grave. But we also have iconographic representations of these little pots. And we have examples of people wearing them around their necks with a little sort of leather string, and they wear them to the gym. So you're going to work out, and this is kind of the ancient, slightly less obnoxious equivalent to Axe or Lynx or whatever it's called, that terrible smelling deodorant. So you'd wear these as a general everyday scent, but they were also used in death rituals. So they're very, very important. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was just sticking on the theme of death. I talked about this briefly, but this is a fairly beaten up Athenian white ground lekithos. And I mentioned these briefly in the lecture. I don't think they're in the syllabus, but they're extremely important. And they're the best kind of visual representation we have of Greek funerals, because they're very often depicted on them. And as I said in the lecture, there's a lot of noise around these, like they were custom made for individuals after they died, which is not true. If you've worked with pottery, it's just ancient pottery didn't work that way. So they were mass produced, and they could maybe be custom painted at the end, but they wouldn't be custom created. And I think when you see these things published, you see the white slip on the outside, which is hence the name white ground lekythoi. But if you look at this one, I wanted to show you, it actually looks Athenian. This looks like that kind of orangey Athenian clay with the shiny black slip on it. So I just wanted to show that, you know, these things are Athenian, and that's how we know they're Athenian. Because very often, I think from an art historical perspective, we look at the paintings and the painted scenes and try and figure out, you know, say, oh, this looks Athenian or this looks something else. Well, we know it looks Athenian because of the clay and the clay color. And we have this here, which is a pretty good example of an Athenian piece. So this is the wall of a big Athenian bell crater. You can't quite see, but this would be a massive, massive vessel. Again, this, although broken, this probably came from a tomb. And it's quite a good example of what Athenian pottery kind of looks like and how we can spot it. So it's got this really shiny black slip. And truth be told, when I was a student, the first one of these that I found in an excavation, I put it in the modern pot pile and nearly threw it out because it was so shiny. It looks like it was made almost yesterday. And this is the difference between slip and paint. Slip is applied before firing, and it's a clay, and it's a clay with very specific properties that fires this really beautiful, shiny black. And again, one of the reasons why Athens was so famous for its pottery is because of the clay around Athens. It is very iron rich, so you could produce this brilliant sheen on the pottery. And again, people only figured out how to recreate this in the 1940s. It was a German chemist that figured it out. So this was a mystery for a long time. And it's not paint, because paint comes off. As you can see on the lekythos here, if you look at the top, you can see there's a little band of like a Greek, a key of Athens, or a meander pattern around the top. That's in paint, and that doesn't survive, but slip survives really, really well. And this is obviously red figures, so you've got the black slip all around, and then you've got the red palmette left blank. And actually you can tell that this is kind of later red figure, because this doesn't, it's not very well made. Like, it doesn't look as beautiful as maybe the pieces in your syllabus. And red figure, like black figure, kind of declined in quality as it went on. So this is probably a later red figure Krater. So maybe 4th century, or maybe even into the 3rd century. But I wanted to show this, just give you an idea about the sheen and the slip on these things. Like, they're absolutely incredible. And it's not entirely show and tell, this whole talk, but I wanted to also come to one other piece, which is this. Does anybody recognize what kind of piece this is? Well, if you said a kylix, you're correct. This is an Athenian kylix, and it's one of these classical drinking cups. It's a similar type of vessel, broadly defined, to the Dionysus one that you have. Ah, brilliant, Sandra. Excellent. A kylix. Yes, you're spot on. It's a similar type of vessel to the Dionysus one that you have in your syllabus, only this one isn't painted. So this is far more indicative of what a regular kylix would have looked like. So it's estimated that somewhere between 70 and 93% of pots were not painted. So the painted pots that we deal with, the ones with a nice slip and the nice seams on them, represent a real minority of vessels. So the vast majority of pottery wouldn't have been painted, and it would have been kind of your workaday, like your plates or bowls that you would use at home. And basically, we're trying to understand ancient Greece through maybe the mugs or the fancy cups you would use if your friends come over for dinner. So there's an issue there to consider. Now the reason I picked this is it's very, very interesting. So not only is it covered in this Athenian black slip, which you can see if I hold it correctly here in the light, and you can see how shiny this all is, but can you hear something? Okay, so this is part of the genre of symposium vessels that are that have funny things with them. So some of them have eyes underneath them, some of them have penises or other obscene things under them. Some of them have maybe donkey faces under them, and a lot of them have weird noises. And this is one. It's a rattle cup. There's a little tiny ball of clay in the foot here, and when you spin it around, it makes a slightly funny rattling noise. And this is kind of connected to the Symposium. And this is something that it kind of fits within that sort of wider genre of kind of novelty vases. So it's kind of interesting. And I think the Dionysus one by Exekias sort of fits into that. I find it very cool. And if you look at images of ancient symposia, they're holding these cups and they play that game Cotobus. I'm not going to do this, but they put their finger through here and there's wine, there's sludge of wine in the bottom of this. Kylix very often have a little indent or divot here. And then you sort of fling that and it sort of sends the sludge all over the wall. And you try to get that within this circle in the game of Cotobus. I have a question. Would the major painted pieces we find in graves have been used? Exekias kylix. Yes, I think there's no way to definitively answer that. But I think the balance of probabilities is that they would have been used. And the current theories, which I think are pretty good, would suggest that the vessels, the major painted pieces would have been used by the person, the deceased, and then they would have been buried with them. So they would have probably had some sort of a funeral feast, one last go in the kylix, and then they would be buried and kind of sealed in, because I think a lot of these have signs of residue on them. So certainly the cups, and wine is usually quite easy to spot on cups because it kind of degrades and you get something called tartaric acid, which shows up usually as a white kind of a crust on the inside of these. If you have tartaric acid, then you have use wear. So I don't know of the large craters, but I suspect if there's use wear in the cups, there would have been, the craters would have been used as well. So that's sort of generally the interpretation, is that they would have been used. That actually brings up a good point, Sandra, because I think the way that we look at ancient artifacts like these kylix or the works by Exekias is that we tend to look at them as objects of art. But as you've asked in your question, I think it's really important to think of them as having been living objects. So they would have been very much part of an experience of someone's life, and they would have been expressions of people. So if someone comes over to my house and I have a whole set of nice shiny kylix, then that's saying something. If someone comes over to my house and I have a bunch of broken old courseware cups, that's saying something quite differently as well. And I think that this kind of fits in with, even nowadays, like what you drink and how you drink says a lot about your sort of situation within society. For example, if I showed up today and I was standing outside drinking a tin of cider, you might have one impression of me. If I showed up in a tuxedo and I was having a glass of champagne, you might have another impression of me. Probably universal to both of those is, why is this man drinking at this hour? But I think that there is something to that. I see Paul just put up a link to Michael Scott and using vessels at the Symposium. This is definitely worth a watch. I think that's something that we need to consider with a lot of these vessels, is that they would have actually been used. So I think that's something quite different. I'll just move on slightly. So some of the main, if there's a main kind of theme at the moment in archaeological research across all of the media of the Greek art that you're looking at, so statuary, pottery, and architectural sculpture, it's probably something like production and consumption. Archaeology and art history to a lesser extent, but also art history, has become very interested in production and consumption. And these are two big themes that maybe are worth your students thinking about. So how were things produced? Where were they produced? And where were they used? So what was the context of these? And a problem with a lot of what we study is that we don't know the context. So things show up in museums or things show up in collections, and the original find spot is not necessarily very clear. So this raises a certain amount of problems, but they're not insurmountable. So where you don't have a clear context, the image becomes important, because the image is the best way of defining how we interpret these things, what was depicted and in what style. And this is what John Beasley did with red and black figure pottery. But where we know the context, we can do other things. We can start to consider how things were made, what resources were involved, and start to kind of problematize that a little bit. So I did my PhD on a site called Sicyon, which is very near Corinth. And I lived there for a chunk of my PhD, actually. And Sicyon is really, really famous for sculpture. And this site, for being so widely associated with sculpture and marble sculpture and bronze working, we found zero evidence on an archaeological survey of the entire city of sculpture manufacture or of bronze manufacture. We found a few bronze slags, but I don't think they're anything to do with statuary. And when we start to think about this more, it becomes kind of interesting. So we're talking now, thinking about statues and thinking about production. So if Sicyon was a center for producing statuary, the nearest marble quarries to Sicyon are about 120 kilometers away. And that's Mount Parnon. And those marble quarries are really not very useful. I think 120 kilometers. It's certainly more than 3 days walk. And the marble used in those is not usable marble. So where was the marble coming from? So they must have been importing it to Sicyon. And what's interesting, Sicyon isn't on any of the Cycladic or Aegean trade routes. It's on an Adriatic trade route. So there's a major problem here. If you have these sculptors in one city, there's no marble nearby. Where's the marble coming from? And how are you bringing in such large quantities of marble for people to work? And I think this is something that hasn't really been discussed very often. And it's something that's always bothered me. The most expensive aspect of constructing the Parthenon and developing the Acropolis was quarrying and carrying the stone. And so if you're going to spend that much money constructing something as monumental as a Parthenon, are you going to spend anything near similar amounts of money to train a bunch of artists how to use marble? So it is interesting, and it does start to beg some questions. I'll just read the chat here for a second. Perfect, okay. So I think that's something that's worth considering, because we often look at maybe a Kouros and say, okay, this is, a generation before the Critios boy, for example. But what does that mean? Where was it produced? What was the context of its production, if we can tell that? And where was it found? And kind of following on from the theme of Sicyon and sculpture, I want to move on and talk a little bit about Delphi and just sort of talk around some of the architectural sculpture that you will be considering for your syllabus. So the Siphnian Treasury, the sculptures from the Siphnian Treasury are one of the pieces on your syllabus. And the Siphnian Treasury itself is very, very interesting. It's one of the most important archaeological buildings in Greece. It dates reasonably firmly to 535, 525 BCE. And this kind of tight date has been basically hypothesized from references in Herodotus and from archaeological and other historical references. So the island of Siphnos in the middle of the Cyclades struck gold and silver, and they became very, very wealthy for a short period of time until their neighbors realized that they had gold and silver and took them over. And so during this time, they built this treasury at Delphi, and it's a very prominent treasury, and it's the first example of caryatids we have at any of these Panhellenic sanctuaries. So it's very, very important. No, there are some people have called this into question whether it's that or whether it's a later building, but I think the general consensus is that this is Siphnian treasury. And we know Siphnos was basically powerful for about 10 years when they get most of the resources to create this kind of sanctuary, or this treasury, which was really, really, really significant archaeologically, because that gives us a date of 535 to 525, and then any pottery or other associations with that, we can start to build our chronology around. Like, does this look like the Siphnian treasury? If it does, then it's of this period. Does it look like the Parthenon destruction? If it does, then maybe it's 480. So it's a crucial thing, archaeologically and art historically as well. But again, thinking about production of this is really interesting. So the Siphnian treasury was built entirely out of marble, and I don't believe the marble came from Siphnos. I think it's generally considered to have come from the island of Paros, which is very famous, obviously, for Parian marble. So you're bringing this marble all the way around the Aegean, around the Peloponnese, up the Corinthian Gulf and to Delphi, and then you're working it there. And this is similar with the Sicyonian treasury, which is beside the Siphnian treasury. And the Sicyonian treasury wasn't the first treasury at Delphi. It was one of the early ones, but it wasn't the first. The Corinthian was probably the first. But the Sicyonian one has 3 different phases, and the first one probably dates to about 580 BC or BCE. And what's really interesting about this is the marble for the first phase, or the limestone, was brought over from Sicyon. This marble has been analyzed petrographically and microscopically, and they brought every single block from Sicyon to Delphi. Now, this isn't a huge thing because Sicyon is only across the Corinthian Gulf from Delphi, so you could sail over there in a day easily. But the fact that they quarried out all this limestone and brought it over really starts to make this a very interesting set of questions. Like, you're building these treasuries. Your treasuries are basically a way of holding wealth at a Panhellenic sanctuary where lots of people go to. And in addition to that, it's kind of an element of display. So you're showing how prominent your city is, as everybody would have gone to visit, or as anybody who would have gone to visit the Delphic Oracle would have had to pass your treasury and said, oh, Sicyon, wow, that's pretty impressive. They must be doing well for themselves. And we have at least 3 rebuildings of this treasury, which seem to fit roughly with changes in rule at Sicyon. So it's almost like they're reaffirming their connection with Delphi. And as they rebuild, they continue to bring the stone from their local area, from Sicyon, this limestone, which you couldn't sculpt out of. They bring this over to Delphi with every rebuilding. And I don't think that was just Sicyon. So there's something very, very interesting there about when you start to look at production. So you get quite common iconography. So you might get the centaurs and the lapiths, or, you know, the gods versus the titans represented in various imagery around this time. But it's very, very interesting that despite this sort of common sense of image, the resources are actually quite individual, and they're coming from individual areas, or at least so it seems. So I think that's something to consider, I guess, when you're presenting any kind of ancient art. Rebecca, sorry, you have your hand up.
Hi, I'm so glad that you started talking about the treasuries. And because the question that I had, and I was wondering whether or not it was appropriate to give it as a question, was about the treasury, but about the Athenian treasury. I spent 2 nights, sat up all night with one of my students last year because she got really into the use of marble and why they were trying, you know, where the marble came from, and this whole sort of politics of marble. So I just wonder if you know about the Athenian treasury, because it looks on your website, it looks as, or the Warwick website, it told us that it had come from, it was Pentelic marble. And then she found other references that said that it was Parian marble. And so, and it seems really confused. So if you could just tell me how we find out about that, please, that'd be excellent.
There's an article by Stephen Tracy, several articles. And Stephen Tracy is a very well-known epigrapher who used to be the director of the American School. And he studied the Athenian treasury in massive amount of detail, the inscriptions on it, but also the stonework as well. So I can actually find this in a few minutes and I can send it to you in the link in the chat. But yeah, Stephen Tracy should have something on that. The complication with the Athenian treasury, like most of the other treasuries, or some of the other treasuries, it has several phases of construction and reconstruction as well. So, so we may be dealing with different types of marble there as well. And this is kind of, it's an interesting thing. I don't want to get onto this too much because we're short on time, but it's a very interesting thing because very often people assume that one particular building is constructed in one particular stone, or one particular pot is constructed in one particular way. And it's not really until you start to do microscopic analysis that you can actually really start to tease out the details. And that doesn't always even become clear through that. So it is something that I think you and your student are very right to question this, because especially if you're getting different descriptions in different sources. Anyway, I'll look up this article and send you a JSTOR link to it in a few minutes here. And yeah, I hope that helps. But if you or if your student, or if any of you have questions about anything to do with Greek art or archaeology for that matter, just feel absolutely free to give me a shout. Get in touch by email or Microsoft Teams or whatever suits.